This image of United States colored troops is from an exhibit by the Talbot County Historical Society, and it details the history of Talbot County United States colored troops. And this image is one of the most popular images that you will find concerning the 189,000 black soldiers who served, slave and free, who served during the Civil War. And as a result, you have this image in your mind, but many people have no idea about what entailed their journey to become free as a result of the Civil War. Let's move on. This image, men of color to arms, came about into the war. The war began in 1861 and lasted until 1865. In the process, most people tended to think that the war would simply last a very short period of time. So most people did not think about it until some people were injured because they came out in their Sunday dress when they heard that there was a battle going on between the Union and the Confederacy. And gradually, President Lincoln and his cabinet soon realized that they were sending out quotas for the different counties, especially in Maryland and in other states. And Maryland was quite different from other states because it was a border state. It was half slave and half free. As a result, Maryland never did reach its quota. So something had to be done. So the president and his cabinet came up with different proposals. One, make an agreement with the governor, Governor Hicks from Cambridge, and the agreement was that the soldiers from Maryland would only serve in Maryland and help to protect Washington, D.C. But a skirmish occurred in the eastern shore of Maryland, and they were sent out of state. Many of those volunteers thought that they had been tricked. Many of them simply absconded the state. They simply stopped volunteering. So the state of Maryland had a problem. How do you get more soldiers to enlist? And one proposal was, well, what about free black soldiers? That was not accepted by most people. The Union did not win any major battles until 1862. And finally, he proposed what is known as a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, which gave the Confederacy precisely 100 days to return to the Union or they lose their slaves. Well, the Confederacy thought it was a worthless piece of paper. They ignored it. So he issued the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. Most slaves believed that they were free. But if you read that document, it states that it only pertained to the states in rebellion. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not free one slave anywhere at any point in time. So individuals still believed that they were free. So they began to free themselves. They simply walked away from plantations. They found ways on the Underground Railroad. They did whatever was necessary. And free blacks began to ask, why can't we join? So some of them began to join in little areas, but still, many slaveholders thought that what's going to happen to their free labor? Another problem existed. Then finally, pay individuals, pay the slaves, or even pay free blacks $2. That was a lot of money, okay? Decided for the disloyal individuals, take their slaves if they prove to be disloyal. And resentment built up. So why not free the slaves or ask for able-bodied soldiers, which meant black and white, which was strange because 6 years prior, there was a Supreme Court ruling of Dred Scott. Dred Scott case simply said that black men had no rights, that white men need respect. and they were not considered to be citizens of the United States. But now that the war is on, blacks could be considered to be eligible to serve. But give $300 to each of the slaveholders for each one of the able-bodied soldiers, which meant basically selling them to the Union Army. And that's how different areas began, especially within the state of Maryland, began to get soldiers. And 5 regiments were formed. More than that, but especially for Talbot County. The 4th, the 7th, 19th, 30th, and 39th. And soldiers began to pour into the Union Army, the United States Colored Troops, as well as the Navy. And one of the individuals from Talbot County, Frederick Augustus Bailey Douglas, sent out a message, men of color to arms. And once they get those buttons and they get the uniforms, they will be proud to serve. When slaveholders recruited or enlisted their slaves into the United States Army and even into the Navy, they had to have diesel manumission. But there was also a commission that was formed. And those individuals had to go, those slaveholders had to go before the commission and to prove that they had not just purchased a slave for a meager sum of money just to get $300. So they had to be approved. Their neighbors and other people had to vouch for them. And if they were proved, the slaveholders were proven to be disloyal, they got no money. But these are manumission and release of service and the promise that they would be freed once the war was over. So these are manumission were freedom papers as such, but yet they were working for the Union. Okay. Here you have the timeline for the 39th, 30th, 19th, 7th, and 4th Infantry United States Colored Troops. These are the timelines where they were created, but also tells the story of when they were mustered in and out of service, as well as the fact that many of them died more from disease than the bullet. And there was still a need to get able-bodied men to serve. So they went to substitutes as well. Blacks also served as substitutes. Individuals, Irishmen, people came from all over the place to serve as substitutes. And it became a lucrative profession. Not just $300, but in some instances, up to $1,500. And sometimes the substitutes would get the money, change their name, go to another county, do the same thing, on and on and on. But soldiers, black and white, were separated in many instances until they began to work together and realized that they were brothers in arms. Frederick Douglass even wanted to, he encouraged and did everything he could to get as many soldiers as possible, especially blacks, slave and free, to enlist. He even tried to enlist himself, but he was too old, so he had 2 sons to serve. And he helped to form the 54th Massachusetts. And this is an example of what their uniform looked like. These were individuals who, trust me, endured. This is heavy, this is hot. And can you imagine fighting in wool uniform in August, July? Imagine that. Okay? And some of the individuals who manufactured the uniforms had the worst material of all, and they made a lot of money during the war. Okay? They were not necessarily concerned about the health and stamina of those individuals, but it was a lucrative profession. The Talbot County Historical Society have videos in different parts of the war that will give you greater understanding of the complexities of the war. It was not as simplistic, and this is from the Civil War Trust. It was not as simplistic as most people thought, that people were just going out fighting and shooting at each other. No, it was much more complex. Because you have to also look at the fact that family members were divided. Family members, one went north, one went south. Others never spoke to each other again, and so many of them lost their lives, and families were disrupted. And when the soldiers were at war, the families also suffered. And with inflation so high, some families never did get back on their feet again. And it was such a bitter war that in some instances is still being fought in many places. And so you have to think in terms of what was going on during that time. And you cannot take it out of the context of time. It happened during such and such period of time, 1861 to 1865. And if you try to apply modern day standards to it, you will be behind a wall with no understanding. That's the best way to describe it. Our colored troops suffered. They did not receive equal pay, definitely not the best flesh, the soldiers. Disease, they suffered in many instances worse than most other soldiers. But even the white soldiers did not receive the best of care, because that was not a good time. And surgeons moved from one soldier to the next, and they did not have the best equipment, and they did not know about disinfectant that much at that time. This is about the soldiers who became prisoners, many of whom died in those prisons, especially in Salisbury, North Carolina. That was one of the worst places that they could have been sent. And many of them simply died from disease more so than anything else. And that was true for most of the soldiers, not just blacks, but for most of the soldiers. And this also talks about the multiple battles of Petersburg and throughout Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. But black soldiers also played a significant part. Many times they were placed on the front lines, but at the same time, if they were captured, they were massacred. The classic example of that was at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, whereby over 300 soldiers, women and children, and their white officers were simply massacred. And it became a rallying cry for black as well as white soldiers, because it was so horrific. No one believed that it would have happened, because it was a war. You generally have the idea of respect for your enemy, but that didn't happen there. Soldiers who participated in the battles and where they were injured, where they died, and those are very good records. And as a result, because the Talbot County Historical Society has done so much research, you can find that information here. Individuals who served in the United States Colored Troops was Nathaniel Hopkins. He didn't serve a full term. When he returned home, he helped to establish a church. He was instrumental in getting his family members educated for the establishment of a school, even a road in the area. But one of the things that we remember him for is being Uncle Nace and Emancipation Day. He was the first individuals to start the Maryland Emancipation Day. Most people said, oh, it's just recent. No, over 147 years. Uncle Nace has descendants who are still here and relatives. Some of them have served as a police chief here. When you think about Uncle Nace, this is a celebration that occurs every year. But it was the first one in the state of Maryland, even before the 13th Amendment was signed. I believe it was November the 1st, around 1864, something like that. But imagine a man who was a former slave, who was concerned with education, the church, and the betterment of his community. And he passed that information down. And every year until he passed, he was in full uniform, full dress, and they had a parade. They told the story of the Civil War. They told the story of what they endured. Uncle Nace. Once the war was over, many soldiers petitioned for money that they were supposed to receive. Many of them did not receive it. Some of them were injured. Many of them were injured. And so they were disabled in many respects. So they petitioned the government, but in many instances, they didn't get the money. Some of them constantly petitioned and petitioned, but most of the soldiers returned home. There were three things that they wanted. First of all, they wanted to be assured that their freedom was, actually free. And so they went home to find their families. Many of the members of their families, if they were slaves, they've been sold everywhere, so their goal was to find family members and reunite with them. A second thing was to find a means of employment to take care of their families. The third thing was to establish a school so that they could teach themselves as well as to educate their children. That was true. There were three things that most of them wanted. And in Talbot County, in the area that became known as Unionville, that was especially true. With the help of former Union soldiers, 18 men from an area that became known as Unionville established Unionville and named it after Union. Of those 18 men, 11 of them, I believe, were at Appomattox when there was a surrender of General Lee to General Grant. Others would have been there, but some were in the hospital at the time. But Unionville has lasted as an all-black community up until about 5 or 7 years ago. And they established a church, St. Stephen's. And those 18 men are buried behind the church. Those 18 men have descendants who are still here in this area. As a matter of fact, I talked to one yesterday, Harriet Lowry, direct descendants. And so we're talking about communities. And some of them had, prior to the war, had lived on the hill. Others were in other places surrounding the area, but gainful employment, finding family members, reuniting with them, and establishing churches and schools, neighboring communities. And so these pictures of them, and what can you say? This is what they wanted once the war was over. And most of them achieved it. The Talbot County Historical Society has created panels of the soldiers of the United States colored troops who served in the war in alphabetical order. And they have a means for you to look at the stories of each of those individuals. And a lot of the information is taken from Fold 3. Fold 3 has the name of the individuals, such as, for example, James Wilson, 19th United States Colored Troop, Company I, okay? Age 21, complexion black. Where was he born? Talbot County, Maryland. Okay, what was his occupation prior to the war? A laborer. Enlisted May 21st, 1863, most likely. We're in Baltimore. Who enlisted him? Captain Birney. For a term of 3 years. The remarks about him: mustered out of service with the regiment January 15, 1867, by Captain Lockwood. This is the information that they've gathered for each of the 602 soldiers. Now, where can you find more information about these individuals? Go to 403, look at the pensions, but if you want to get started, start here. The information is here for you. All you have to do is look.